Well, welcome viewers, Dr. JWA. This one's really got me going because they put it over the humans. They had no trouble with that. And now they're going to try and just bully their way across the whole wildlife species with vaccinations. Now, okay, we have a way of saying yes or no, and we can pay the consequences for that, which we are and which we have. All the evidence is out now that it was just a big money grab by Big Pharma and anybody else that could tag onto it, including politicians and doctors. That's what the vaccine pandemic was about. Now you can scream and shout, jump up and down, whatever, but it was as clear as day. I'm actually quite stupid, and I could see that it was a hoax. But who authorises the vaccinations for wildlife? Wildlife's at the mercy now, as far as I'm concerned. It's at the mercy of Big Pharma. What happens when protecting one wild animal begins changing the biological conditions surrounding thousands of other species? Because they didn't care less about humanity. So I'm not sure what makes you think they're going to care less about the wildlife. Australia's H5 bird flu response is moving vaccination beyond controlled populations and into free-ranging wildlife. Okay, so this is how it would work. If I was a CEO of a pharmaceutical company, just take this on board. Okay, I've had a good run on the humans. They're not going to fall for my product anymore. I'm not going to. But wildlife? Hang on a sec. Who come up with that idea? Now, the people that are involved in all this, the vaccinators, the scientists and all that, they're going to love this, right? Because they're going to have a job. They might get pay rises. They might get incentives. The more vaccine you get out, the better. I wouldn't even be surprised, and this is just skeptical, but in the case of the humans, the vaccinations had to be recorded and all this. I honestly think that in the case of the animals, they will record the vaccinations, but there is a gap between where mass amounts of vaccination can be accounted for and just be paid for and just, yeah. There can be mass amounts of vaccination be paid for and just go missing on this one. I mean, this is huge. This is absolutely huge. After COVID, there has to be somebody, okay, so we haven't got the females speaking up for biological women. That's all crashed. There's no such thing as women's lib. It was all just a big hoax, because they'd be standing up for the biological women that have been taken out by ideology. They haven't stood up for, as a matter of fact, during COVID, when we went to work, my son and I, and the brickies that had the vaccine who were sick, wanted to try and incriminate us who were well and try and blame us for them being sick. So what's happened now is Big Pharma's got the opportunity, and just think about it. If I was a CEO, I'd be going, this is huge. This is the whole wildlife arena. We can pump as much out of this stuff. We can pump as much of this out as possible. We'll start in Australia and we'll send it across the world. So are the animal people, the wildlife people, going to stop and ask themselves, if the pandemic on humans left unresolved disputes over mandates and emergency authority and pharmaceutical influence, informed consent and institutional accountability, is any of these wildlife people going to consider that these measures, right, who's going to stand up for the animals and the wildlife against this somebody's idea that all these things have to be vaccinated? Just remember, the vaccination didn't work on humans. It didn't work. It couldn't have worked. I went to work several times and the blokes that were vaccinated were sick, and we weren't vaccinated and we weren't sick. And nor did we get sick working alongside these guys as bricklayers. I think what a lot of people miss is psychological infusion of illness. In other words, you could have 5 years to live and you've got cancer, but you go to the doctor and he says you've got 6 months to live. So psychologically, you check out after 6 months instead of going for 5 years. It was the same with the vaccine. There was people that believed that they were going to die because of this COVID, and they did. Some people can psychologically take on board, be it not their time to die, that it is their time to die and die. Now, the animals, the wildlife can't speak up like we can. And this is where we're all going to have a close watch as to how the wildlife conservationists, the Greens and all these people apparently are going to defend the animals. Because Big Pharma now has free rein, starting with Australia and however far they want to stretch it, with pushing mass amounts and volumes of vaccine onto the wildlife ecosystem. So where does the intervention enter for the ecosystem? Research on wildlife vaccination shows why this matters. Imperfect immunity can allow infection or transition to continue in wildlife. Under particular conditions, vaccination can create evolutionary selection pressure, potentially favouring greater pathogen virulence. Different species and even different individuals can respond differently. Remember, different people were impacted by the vaccines. Now, they're going to pump out mass amounts, volumes of vaccine into the wildlife. But like humans, individual animals have different genetics, and the vaccines will impact them in different ways. Environmental vaccine deployment can also produce unintended exposure, variable dosing, and consequences for non-target organisms. So because of the ecosystem and the downstream and upstream effects of the food chain, there'll be non-targeted wildlife that's impacted through these mass vaccination decisions on wildlife. Researchers consequently identify ecosystem functioning itself as something requiring assessment. And as soon as I saw that seal come on the TV and they've gone, "Bird, please hit the mammals," and I just went straight away, Big Pharma. Now, these consequences of mass vaccination in the wildlife can become counterintuitive. In one modelled enzootic rabies system, immediate vaccination produced more rabies deaths than lower or higher vaccine levels. I'm going to say that again. In one modelled enzootic rabies system, immediate vaccination produced more rabies deaths than lower or higher vaccination levels. And researchers proposed that protecting breeding animals could maintain susceptible offspring, impact pregnant animals, creating demographic refuges allowing the pathogen to persist. Now, following that consequence downstream, the vaccination changes immunity. Immunity changes survival, and survival under the vaccination and the downstream effects changes reproduction. Reproduction changes population structure, and population structure changes transmission. And the population changes can alter predatory-prey relationships, scavenging, competition and disease movement through the food web. So, who's authorising all this? Does anybody know? Because this is going to be mass. This will be driven the same way as COVID was, the vaccines for that. Now, that does not prove vaccines genetically modify wildlife, but it doesn't disprove it either, or physically bioaccumulate through predators. But the evidence examined does not establish that. But it doesn't disqualify it either. And the unanswered question is potentially larger. What are the multi-generational, evolutionary, and population consequences of deliberately altering immunity throughout the wildlife ecosystem? Because once biological intervention becomes population-wide, the needle is no longer the boundary, the ecosystem is. And that leaves Australia with the question nobody should be permitted to avoid. And then I'm going to close with this. Who possesses the authority to intervene at that scale, and who becomes accountable if protecting one species ultimately changes the biological system surrounding it forever? And that's potentially what could happen. Who do you know that's taken accountability for all the mess of the COVID vaccines? Because nobody, I believe, will take either, even less so, accountability for what they're going to do to the wildlife and habitat and species in Australia. They don't even know how many sharks are out there. We're listening to the fishermen, not the Department of Fisheries. They're just blatantly lying. No one's going to take accountability of this. They're going to take the money and run, just like they are with the windmills and the solar and all the rest. This just goes on and on and on and on. And it's so obvious now. It's so in our faces. God help. They said when Golf Whitlam got the sack, Golf Whitlam said, God save the Queen and God help. No, hang on. What did he say? God save the Governor General or something. Or God help the Governor General. Somebody's got to help the wildlife, because these needles, they're going to be going into any animal they can get them in. You watch this space. Blow the humans, they're onto us. Let's use science to get the animals. Uncountable amount of opportunities to make money. I tell you what, the brilliance behind the evil to profit, it is just absolutely unbelievable. I'll see you in the next episode. I'm going to do more on this. Bye for now.